The first thing I noticed when I saw her standing across the hometown fair was the envelope in her hand. It was old, yellowed at the edges, folded so many times that the paper looked tired, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. I had spent 23 years trying to forget that handwriting, because it belonged to the one person I had loved before I understood what love really meant. And when she finally reached me through the crowd, she didn't ask how I had been, where I had lived, or why I had disappeared from town. She simply looked into my eyes and asked the question that had followed me for more than half my life: why did you never answer my letter? If you believe that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a person's life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so our community can keep sharing stories that remind us that sometimes the hardest thing to forgive is not another person, but ourselves. My name is Everett Cole, and for most of my adult life, I had convinced myself that the past was something you could pack away if you worked hard enough. I had left Bellwood when I was 19, carrying 2 suitcases, a scholarship acceptance letter, and a heart full of things I didn't know how to say. I told myself I was leaving because I wanted a bigger life, but the truth was more complicated. My father had lost his job at the lumber mill, my mother was working extra shifts at the grocery store, and there were bills on our kitchen table that seemed to multiply every morning. I had been accepted into a college 3 states away, and I knew it was my chance to escape the limitations that seemed to surround our family. But there was one person in Bellwood who made leaving feel like losing something precious. Her name was Maren Whitlock. Maren had never been the loudest girl at school, and she never seemed to need attention. She had a quiet confidence that made people notice her anyway. She loved old books, kept pressed flowers between the pages of her notebooks, and had a habit of remembering tiny details about people that everyone else forgot. During our senior year, she and I had become inseparable without ever officially deciding to be. We studied together in the library, walked home beneath the tall maple trees, and spent Saturday afternoons helping each other prepare for the futures we were both convinced would be extraordinary. I had loved her long before I had the courage to admit it, and I suspected she loved me too, but neither of us ever said the words because saying them would have made the future real, and neither of us knew what the future was going to demand. The week before graduation, I received my college acceptance package. I remember running home with the envelope pressed against my chest, expecting my parents to celebrate, but instead I found my father sitting at the kitchen table with his head lowered and a stack of unpaid bills in front of him. That evening, he told me that he couldn't afford to help me with college, and for the first time I saw shame in his eyes. I told him I would find a way. I promised my mother I would work, study, and send money home whenever I could. Then, instead of telling Maren what was happening, I began pulling away from her. I thought I was protecting her from the uncertainty of my life. I thought she deserved someone who could promise her a future instead of someone who was leaving town with nothing but determination and fear. On graduation day, Maren gave me a small blue notebook with a handwritten message inside. She told me to open it when I reached college. I thanked her, hugged her, and promised I would write. I meant it. I really did. But life became harder than I expected. My first semester was a blur of classes, cafeteria shifts, cleaning offices after hours, and weekend work at a warehouse. I slept very little and ate whatever I could afford. At home, my father's health was beginning to decline, although he tried to hide it from me. Every phone call seemed to bring another problem. Then, 3 months after I left Bellwood, a letter arrived at my dorm. It was from Maren. I recognized her handwriting before I even opened it. The letter was several pages long. She wrote about school, about her mother, about a stray dog she had started feeding, and about the maple tree near the old football field where we used to sit. But beneath all those ordinary details was something much more important. She wrote that she missed me. She wrote that she didn't care if I was struggling, because struggling was not the same thing as failing. She said she wanted me to tell her the truth instead of deciding for her what she could or could not handle. And near the end, she wrote that she loved me. I read that sentence again and again. Then I folded the letter and put it inside my desk. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't love her. I didn't answer because I was terrified. I believed that if I wrote back, I would have to admit that I was lonely, frightened, and unsure of myself. I believed that telling her the truth would make her feel responsible for me. So I made the cowardly decision to remain silent. Weeks passed. Then months. I eventually moved into a tiny apartment near campus, took on more work, and slowly built the life I thought I needed. I graduated, found a stable job, married my ambitions to routine, and eventually returned to Bellwood only occasionally. I never married. Whenever someone asked why, I always gave a simple answer. I told them I had never met the right person. The truth was that I had met her when I was 17, and I had spent the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had been brave enough to answer one letter. 23 years later, I returned to Bellwood for the annual summer fair because my younger sister, Meredith, had convinced me to help her run the family food stall. The fair looked almost exactly as I remembered it. Children carried balloons between rows of colorful booths. Families stood in line for lemonade and funnel cakes. Music floated across the field, and the afternoon sun turned everything warm and golden. I was carrying a box of paper cups when I looked toward the old carousel and saw Maren. For several seconds, neither of us moved. She looked older, of course. So did I. There were silver strands in her hair, fine lines around her eyes, and a calmness in her face that hadn't been there when we were teenagers. But I recognized her smile before she even smiled at me. She was holding an old envelope against her chest. Then she walked toward me. She didn't accuse me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an apology. She simply stood in front of me and asked why I never answered her letter. The world around us seemed to become strangely quiet. I could hear the carousel music, the laughter of children, the distant sound of a vendor calling people toward a game booth, but all I could think about was a dorm room from 23 years earlier and a frightened young man who had folded a letter instead of answering it. I finally told her the truth. I told her I had been ashamed of how difficult my life had become. I told her I thought she deserved better than uncertainty. I told her that I had loved her, but I had been too afraid to let her see how badly I was struggling. I admitted that I had convinced myself silence was an act of protection when it was really an act of fear. Maren listened without interrupting. Then she told me something that broke my heart in a completely different way. She had waited. For months, she had expected an answer. Then she had assumed I had found someone else. Eventually, she decided that perhaps I had never loved her at all. She had moved away after college, built a career restoring historic homes, and eventually returned to Bellwood to care for her aging mother. She had loved other people, but she had never forgotten the unanswered letter. She had carried it for years because she couldn't understand how something that had felt so real could disappear without explanation. Then she opened the envelope. Inside was not her original letter. It was my old blue notebook. The one she had given me before graduation. I had kept it all those years. Every page was filled with things I had never said. I had written about missing her, about my father's illness, about the jobs I worked, about every time I wanted to call her and couldn't find the courage. On the final page, written in my 20-year-old handwriting, were 3 words I had never sent anywhere: I still love her. Maren's eyes filled with tears when she read it. But she didn't suddenly erase the past. She didn't pretend 23 years had never happened. She simply told me that forgiveness wasn't the same as pretending the hurt had never existed. Forgiveness meant finally allowing the truth to be bigger than the pain. That afternoon, we walked through the fair together. We stopped near the old maple tree, which was still standing beside the school field even though the branches had become wider and lower. We sat beneath it just as we had when we were teenagers, except this time there was no pressure to decide our entire future before sunset. We talked about everything we had missed. We talked about the people we had lost, the mistakes we had made, the dreams that had changed, and the versions of ourselves we wished we could have protected. I apologized again. She accepted the apology, but then she reminded me that I owed an apology to the young man I had once been too. She said I had spent years punishing myself for being afraid, when that frightened young man had simply needed someone to tell him that he didn't have to carry everything alone. That sentence stayed with me. For the first time, I realized that redemption doesn't always mean getting back what you lost. Sometimes it means becoming the kind of person who would never again make the same mistake. The fair continued around us as the afternoon slowly moved toward early evening, but we remained beneath that tree while sunlight filtered through the leaves. There was no dramatic promise, no impossible declaration that everything would immediately become perfect. Instead, there was something much more meaningful: honesty. Before we left, Maren asked me to walk with her toward the community center where she volunteered. She had been helping organize a program for teenagers who were struggling with family problems, financial pressure, and uncertainty about their futures. She told me she wanted them to know that being afraid didn't make them weak, and asking for help didn't make them failures. I realized then that the pain we carry can either harden us or teach us how to hold someone else's pain more gently. Weeks passed after the fair, and Maren and I began seeing each other again. We didn't try to recreate high school. We didn't pretend we were 17. We met for breakfast, walked through the park during sunny afternoons, visited local bookstores, and talked until we ran out of things to hide. We learned each other's adult lives instead of trying to recover our teenage ones. Eventually, I told her that I still regretted the letter. She smiled and told me that perhaps the letter had not been lost after all. Perhaps it had simply taken 23 years to receive its answer. That answer was not a perfect life. It was forgiveness. It was courage. It was the realization that love sometimes survives not because people never hurt each other, but because they eventually become brave enough to tell the truth. A year later, we returned to the hometown fair together. The same carousel turned beneath the bright afternoon sky, children ran between the booths, and the smell of warm cinnamon drifted through the air. Maren brought the old letter again, but this time she wasn't carrying it like a wound. She carried it like a reminder. We stood beneath the maple tree, and she placed the letter in my hands. I had spent 23 years believing that this piece of paper represented the greatest mistake of my life. Now I understood that it represented something else. A second chance. Not a second chance to become teenagers again, but a second chance to become honest adults who finally understood what those teenagers had been trying to say. Before we walked back toward the fair, I looked at Maren and realized something I wish I had understood at 17. Sometimes the person you are most afraid of losing is not asking you to have all the answers. They are simply asking you to be honest enough to let them stand beside you while you figure things out. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us this: have you ever wished you had answered a letter, made a phone call, or told someone how you truly felt before it was too late? Your words might give someone in our community the courage to say what they have been afraid to say. As Maren and I walked through the bright fairgrounds together, I looked at the old letter one last time before placing it safely inside my jacket. The paper was still worn, the handwriting still faded, and the past could never be rewritten. But for the first time, I wasn't wishing I could change it. I was grateful that it had brought us back to the truth. Because sometimes life doesn't give us the chance to undo our mistakes. Sometimes it gives us something even more precious. The chance to finally understand them, forgive ourselves, and choose differently when the next door opens. And as we walked beneath the warm afternoon sun, Maren reached for my hand. This time, I didn't let go.